Came, I saw, I came, I saw, I praise the Lord, then break the law. I take what's mine, then take some more. It rains, it pours, it rains, it pours. I came, I saw, I came, I saw.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the Spicy Podcast. I'm joined by my usual society member Tarek.
Just 1 second, let me have a sip of my Monster Energy Ultra.
Beautiful.
Yeah, are we still recording? Hello there, everyone.
For those of you that don't know, we live in a society that requires a Monster Energy drink for all your boomer needs. No, but yeah. So today we're going to be discussing Arab nationalism. Well, we're going to be doing more a broader scope of Arab ideologies. So we're going to touch upon some fascism and some communism, but mainly it's going to be about Arab nationalism. It's part of our 7-part podcast about the Middle East. So this is the second one, and but before we do any of that, I'd like to introduce our sponsor, Varg Vikernes. Thank you, Varg, for introducing me to the Thulean perspective and realizing Nordic supremacy is the only way to go in this world. Again, thank you from us barbarian Arabs to you, a Nordic prince, for your contributions to society, and thank you for funding this podcast.
Varg wanted us to tell you the following ad. What if you wanted to go to Valhalla, but Wolverine said, "Nah, remember the last time we were watching porn?" So stop watching porn, guys.
Yeah.
How you look sale.
For those not familiar, Varg is like this. He's like this traditionalist guy that advocates for not watching porn, and among other things. But he's mainly known for telling people not to watch porn. But yeah. I
mean, it's basically an unprim, really.
Yeah.
Stuff to think about.
Yeah, anarcho-primitive. Yeah, it's pretty much his ideology, but.
Yeah, I mean, he's like the antithesis of a boomer or something like that. But whatever.
All right. Well, anyways, Varg aside, we're going to be jumping right into the subject. So this all kind of starts out with the Arab Revolt. For those not familiar, again, there was a thing called the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence in 1923, and that laid down the groundwork for a unified Arab state. And obviously that didn't happen. It was between the Sharif of Mecca and the British High Commissioner. They basically agreed upon if the Arabs helped in the revolt against the Ottoman Empire, that there would be a unified Arab state. But in the back room of the British meetings and councils, they said, no, we don't want that because that serves against our interests in the Middle East. So, of course, what ended up happening was a Sykes-Picot agreement between the French and the British, and the lines that we saw drawn in the Mashriq. Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they were able to benefit off of this because Saudi Arabia was unified after they fought with the Najd and the Hashemite and the Hijaz, and they were basically able to come away with that with a monarchy subservient to the West, and it's basically stayed that way up until now. And they've been benefactors of that. Turkey, I think they were initially supposed to be carved up as well, but they avoided that. They've been pretty okay ever since, with the exception of their various coups and such. But generally, they're better off than other countries.
Relatively.
What was that?
Relatively okay, you know.
Yeah, relatively okay.
I mean, I think that's a word we're gonna be using more on this podcast. It's all about relative rules.
Yeah, in context of the rest of the Middle East, yeah, they've been okay. And that's what we consider the Arab Revolt was I guess self-explanatory. The Arabs revolted against the Ottomans with the help of the British. They received large amounts of funds and weapons to counteract. And now the main, I guess, survivors of that era in terms of monarchs are the Saud family and the Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. But other than that, all the rest of those monarchs, because they implemented monarchs from that era in Iraq, in Syria. But yeah, those guys got taken out pretty quickly. But that's for the future of this subject. But if we move past World War I, there's nothing really happened. You just kind of have this...
The mandates.
Yeah, just the mandates. You know, they were called mandates, but really they're just colonies. And they had their British puppet kings in there. Same thing with Egypt. They had their British puppet king, and you know, it's self-explanatory.
I mean, I'll just have to make a side note here. Indeed, you had them, the Brits with their kings, but the French had a thing for republics, you know, républiques and shit. So that's what you got in Lebanon. That's what you got in Syria, and although in the Maghreb it also had kings still, even in the French colonies, but We don't really care about them, so we're gonna talk about Syria and Lebanon.
Yeah, actually, I think I made a mistake by saying that they had the Syrian king. I don't. Did they have a
I
king?
mean, we had one.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, because they wanted to create a unified Iraqi and Syrian state.
Mashallah, mashallah, mashallah.
Yeah, so yeah, they did have a king. But in Lebanon, if we're jumping ahead to like World War II, we kind of saw the development of what we consider the modern nationalist ideologies. In Lebanon, it's pretty interesting because they took the opportunity in World War II to to say that we don't want to be part of this, and they declared themselves independent. And they created that weird, like, what was it? The Unwritten National Pact of 1943, where they had a Maronite Christian as its Speaker of the Parliament and a
Yeah.
Shiite as a Prime Minister, and the Deputy Speaker was Greek Orthodox and all that. But we also saw the Nazis trying to push their ideologies
Well, what year are we?
for the 1943
Yeah,
is when this.
okay. Yeah.
Well, the fascist Golden Square in Iraq was 1941. The Unwritten National Pact for Lebanon was 1942.
Oh yeah, no, so sorry, no, I'm getting ahead here.
But yeah, so the fascists in Iraq, Iraq was for all intents and purposes an Axis country because they had a pretty big revolt against the British. But as we all know, Arabs are not the best conventional fighters in the world, so they suffered some staggering losses, and the government went into exile, and the Brits continued with their puppet monarch. But yeah, those are kind of the beginnings of it. And then after World War II is when we saw these kind of thinkers kind of divulge together and start brainstorming. I mean, in Egypt you saw it happening in 1952. In Syria, it's a little bit later, like 1963. We had Qasem, which is kind of this weird social democrat / democratic socialist in 1958.
I think Syria had so many coups, man. It was just so crazy. In 49, we had 3. In 53, we also had a further 3. It was just crazy. And what is also crazy is how many of them just escaped to Brazil even afterwards. We had the Kurdish one. What was the name of the Kurdish one? Shishkhali?
Yeah, it was
fled to Brazil.
Adib Shishkhali, yeah.
Yeah, he fled to Brazil. Then he was killed by a Druze there. A Druze that came from Venezuela. Shit like that. Yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy stuff. I mean, the 40s and the 50s were extremely troubled times. I mean, after the Second World War, there was trouble everywhere, but especially in that region. And that's the reason why so many Syrians emigrated to begin with. During that period, but that's I guess for another episode. But just to give you a context, I have to stop saying but shit.
But yeah, see, now you made me do it. God. All right. So what we consider the main players, which is Eps.6, he's the founder of Ba'ath.
Daddy.
Yeah. He started in Syria in 1963. He was exiled to Iraq. That's where he was buried by no other than Saddam Hussein carrying his casket. The Egyptian Revolutionary Command Council in 1952. That was Abdel Nasser. He was different than Ba'ath. He was kind of this non-aligned movement with Tito, even though he was, for all intents and purposes, an Arab nationalist, because he did try to create many unified Arab states, like particularly the one that everyone's most aware of is the United Arab Republic between Syria and Egypt, and then Lebanon was supposed to be in there as well, but they had a backlash against that, which caused more fighting. Surprise, surprise.
Why is it always ends like that?
Yeah, and there was a lot of attempts. In the United Arab Republic was tried in 1958, just like right after Nasser came to power. Then you had the United Arab States between Egypt, Syria, and North Yemen. North Yemen was the opposite of the communist Yemen, so that's another thing that we have to delve into a little bit later. And then there was the Arab Federation between Jordan and Iraq, which is actually between the monarchs, so King Faisal and King Hussein. That was short-lived, obviously, because of the coups, because that was attempted in 1958, and then shortly after we saw the Qasem come into power in Iraq. Then you have the Federation of Arab Republics, which was Libya, Egypt, and Syria, which Gaddafi was the main proponent of. and that was in 1972, so quite a bit later on. But again, all of these fell apart. So the point I'm getting is that they all kind of shared a similar concept of wanting to unify the Arab world, even though they were part of different political parties. Gaddafi was a lot different than Nasser, and Nasser was a lot different than the Ba'ath and Afla. Even within the Ba'ath, we see difference between Assad and Saddam, and
Yes.
so this is even before Saddam. There's a reason that Aflik fled from Syria is because of disagreements about how they should be Ba'ath.
Yes, so we tend to think of the Ba'ath as this uniform ideology that, or even Arab nationalism as being something, what do you say, coordinated between Arab countries. But in truth, it was just crazy. You had all kinds of differences in narratives that would vary even inside the same country. So we have to just stop thinking that the Ba'ath was just one big thing. They all adopted it. They all followed the same principles, but still the nuances were just absurdly contrasting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the one that everyone kind of looks up to, for the most part, there are disagreements, of course, which is Nasser. Because he was again this non-position kind of third position, non-aligned movement. So he avoided a lot of the backlash. But he did receive some backlash later on because of his management of the Israeli war. He's kind of considered a little bit incompetent. But that aside, we saw a lot of Arab leaders being motivated by him and inspired by him. Saddam went to Egypt. Gaddafi was heavily inspired by him. I don't know who else.
I just wanted to say that Nasser is truly a Chad. And if you just look at pictures of him, that's like clearly the Chad bone structure. But
I was gonna say that people should look up photos of him in sunglasses with Gaddafi. It's like
it's just like Chad overload.
Yeah, the Chad Mafia.
But truly, Nasser was a very inspiring figure in the Arab world, and we gotta say he wasn't Ba'ath, but people still aspire to him, even inside the Ba'ath, and use him as a symbol of Arab unity, even throughout the world. For those who don't know. He died quite early in his political career. He died and also quite early in age. He was 56, if I'm not mistaken. Some people say it was a conspiracy, but Arabs love to make conspiracies about stuff. The main idea here is that it's undeniable how much Nasser has inspired the Arab world, even after his death. And we have to also consider him as this shaping figure, and how Arab nationalism was going to be handled from now on, even from the Gaddafi third position point of view. That doesn't sound good. Third position. Okay, third positionism to the Ba'ath we had in Syria, the Ba'ath we had in Iraq, and to the future of Egypt. This Arab identity or Arab nationalism, even Pan-Arabism, had shaped Arab politics for the following years, even after Nasser passed away.
Yeah, and so in regards to the conspiracy, he kind of died under mysterious circumstances because he boarded a plane and then it landed and he was dead. So people like to speculate, and it's not based on nothing because there have been a lot of Mossad assassinations.
Oh boy,
and those are the reasons that people like to speculate, is because we just know about the ones that have been found out about, and those have been pretty numerous in themselves. So it's not beyond it's not beyond the realm of possibility that something like that would happen. But as far as we know, it wasn't an assassination. It was just a freak accident. But again, that's just a little bit of a caveat. But moving on from Nasser,
miss him so much.
Yeah, Tariq is correct that he did influence all the Arab leaders pretty much. He was the first one to try to attempt these kinds of unification processes, and again, he was also really influential in the fact that he fought the Muslim Brotherhood. He was very outspoken against the Islamization of the society. He wanted to keep it secular and I guess modern is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add that's another very good point, which is secularism, and the secularism has always been a very just as much as Arab nationalism, secularism has always been this, this very important, this pillar of Arab nationalism. For some reason, people stuck to it. well, it's not for some reason.
Yeah.
We can elaborate on that later. But indeed, secularism is a very important, that again, pillar of the ideology passed on by Nasser. Even though sectarianism has been gaining quite a lot of traction lately, we have to remember that it wasn't always like that. Arabs really wanted to secularize. They really wanted to put nationality ahead of sect. That's why these Arab nationalists, these pan-Arabists, always wanted to push for secularism. Oh, you're an Arab first, then you are whatever you want.
Yeah, we saw it in the tenets of a lot of these ideologies, like even within specifically the three core tenets of Ba'ath, we see, what is it, socialism, secularism, and pan-Arab unity. I mean, they saw it beneficial to put that as their core tenet, right? And even the founders, like the Michael Iflik, the one in Syria, he was a Christian, you know? That's how we see how fundamental the secularism was to these ideologies. And again, it all pretty much started with Nasser when he kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood. He was very, very outspoken against them. You know, I can't stress that enough. That if it wasn't for him, I don't think other people would have the courage to do something similar. Because then we saw the Muslim Brotherhood being fought in Syria later on, and it kind of drew parallels between how Nasser did it and how Assad did it. But yeah, secularism is something that we should touch upon in more depth later on. But I guess that would be for the.
We're gonna touch into so many things later on.
We're gonna touch so many places, Tarek. You're not gonna believe it.
Yeah. Oh boy.
But yeah. So we're pretty much in the 50s right now. I know we jumped around a little bit, but right now we're talking about the 50s with Nasser.
Late 50s.
Yeah, the late 50s. You know, these consolidation attempts obviously failed because of ulterior motives between the leaders. Like when Gaddafi tried to unify the states as well, Anwar Sadat said, "No, this guy's too radical, and we don't want to deal with this." So, and then with the attempts jumping backwards a little bit with Egypt and Syria, the Syrians thought that they were getting the raw end of the deal here, and that they were being represented properly, so they broke off. And you know, it's always kind of been the same repeating pattern where people don't feel like they're being represented, but it's usually just someone that wants to consolidate their power instead of sharing it. I mean, that's the that's the story of the Arab world, right? And I mean, where are we now? We're in the. You want to jump a little bit to the 60s?
Early 60s.
Yeah.
Because that's when the nice stuff starts happening. That's when you have the wars. That's where you have the coups, and that's when you had the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, and I can't preface enough how much the Cold War played a part in this, because if there wasn't a counterbalance available, such as the Soviet Union, none of this would have been possible. There have been some declassified CIA documents that kind of outline how much the Soviet Union was supporting Iraq and Syria, specifically the Ba'ath parties, and it was supplies, manpower, technical experience, advisors. Even though they had some disagreements, because the Iraqi Ba'ath was killing communists, and they didn't agree with how the Syrians were approaching things. But at the end of the day, they were close enough where they could actively support them and provide them with what they needed to thrive. And I mean, again, like I said, this wouldn't be possible today because you have U.S. right now as the main hegemony. Russia is not powerful enough to expand its influence, and China isn't powerful enough to expand its influence. We see it a little bit in Syria because they're trying to get back to how it was before, but that's, again, another topic for a different day.
Oh, what I want to add is that if we're going to talk about how these parties got into power, we have to talk about Arab armies and how the military works in the Arab world. You see, the military is kind of a ladder, if we can say that. It's a way of connecting the lower echelons of society to the higher ones. Of course, you're going to have the officials from respected families or from influential backgrounds, and you're going to have the bottom. But it's possible to ascend to the higher tiers. That was the case in many Arab countries at the time, and that's how you had these very popular ideologies such as Pan-Arabism rising up to take, or basically to coup governments and gain enough popular support to maintain themselves, even though in a military fashion. For instance, that was the case with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was dirt poor. His father was a goat herder. He got into the army, and he started climbing up the hierarchy. Even though he wasn't a colonel by the time, he was, if I'm not mistaken, a sergeant or sergeant lieutenant, sergeant. What do you call?
Well, his final rank?
Lieutenant. Sorry. If I was sick, it was like sergeant lieutenant. Anyway, he got these ideas. He got intimate with these ideas from other circles in the lower parts, in the lower ranks of the Libyan army, and that's how they started mobilizing. Of course, military and politics are a topic in itself. It's actually an interesting one. But we gotta say that throughout the Arab world, we had these military figures going after the governments, taking over governments. That's not just something that happens in a popular democratic fashion. And, well, that's more or less how the Arab world is kind of known for today. Just military leaders.
Yeah, it really did give Gaddafi and Nasser legitimacy because, like you said, they were both officers. I think Gaddafi was a lieutenant colonel by the end of his career. I don't know exactly what Nasser was, but he was an officer as well. But yeah, being able to consolidate the officers and kind of come together and formulate a plan is essentially how those two popular movements came to power. You know, you can't really do it so easily with with just the civilian population. You have to be in some kind of authority figure, or position of authority to have legitimacy in the Arab world. But even like Qasim, the predecessor to the Ba'ath in Iraq, who overthrew the monarchy over there, he was also a military officer, but he ended up getting overthrown by the Ba'ath, obviously.
Everyone gets overthrown.
Yeah, everybody gets overthrown.
Except Bashar.
Again, just to elaborate on that a little bit, actually, Qasim was a really interesting figure because he was really a socialist in his iconography. You know, the way he projected himself was like this socialist leader. He was supported by the Soviet Union. So that's just a little bit of how communism influenced the region. We saw it most predominantly in what was it, South Yemen, they had an actual communist state, which fell apart. And another tangent to add to that, it's really interesting because North and South Yemen, they didn't fight each other, even though one was communist and one was supposed to be quote unquote Arab nationalist. They got along pretty okay, like unlike other split states that we see in the world, like North and South Korea or East and West Germany. You know, it was just a funny side note.
Omar, you're a sophisticated guy. The world is a mess. The world is as angry as it gets. I think splitting Yemen's gonna cause a little more anger. The world is an angry place.
That was a beautiful Trump impersonation by Tarek.
I just wanted to add that you see all kinds of weird stuff in the Arab world. That's a good thing, I think. That's why the Arab world is such a fertile place for political science. You see everything happening there. But indeed, that's something that's going to develop later, how Yemen just became what it is today, and how he unified again with what was his name, Saleh?
Yeah,
Saleh. He had like a $40 billion or something like that. Yeah, it's true. Check it out. Well, let's go back to the north. But one rallying factor we had by the end of the 60s was the wars against Israel, because Israel was just going all out against the Palestinians. And this idea that, they're oppressing our Arab brothers, they're oppressing our kin, has been very, very much entrenched in the Arab mentality, as a matter of fact. And that's how we could say that the wars in Israel were a great way of rallying the Arabs behind one cause, at least. Of course, we got beaten the F out every time, but in a way, at least we won't. It's all about the friends we make along the way, you know. and that was a way of rallying the Arabs. And even today, the flame of the Palestinian liberation is still a very important rhetoric that we see a lot when it comes to Pan-Arabism. Maybe it's the one that's most alive today. If you see what the interest in common between Iraq and Syria, it's not about unifying. It's not about preserving secularism even. It's about freeing Palestine. I would say that's what survives. That's something that kind of shocks people when we talk about radical Islam, and they don't really put reclaiming Al-Quds as the main priority, because they say that liberating Palestine is something that the Pan-Arabists wanted. There is nothing about Palestine in Islam. It's about retaking Al-Quds, but the rest, well,
Yeah.
it's a free game, son.
And just to add a little bit to that war, it's kind of, well, I guess not speculated, but it's pretty well known that the Arabs did poorly. But I mean, for a number of reasons. Arabs aren't really good with conventional armies. This has kind of been documented by T.E. Lawrence during the Arab Revolt that we spoke about earlier. He wrote a book actually about guerrilla warfare, and he said, Arabs are really, really good at guerrilla warfare, but when it comes to being a conventional army, they're just lackluster because of their mentality. They've always been pretty good at guerrilla warfare, never so much at conventional armies. Maybe during the Umayyad Caliphate, but not so much in modern warfare.
I mean, how did we conquer so much? For real. Sometimes I think, well, we're not good. I mean, imagine how bad our enemies must have been to just lose to us.
Well, I mean, we were good in historic warfare, not so much in modern military structures.
Well, that was warfare before, so that was modern warfare 14 centuries ago. But please, we digress.
But I mean, even in the wars against Israel, we did see some advantages that the Israelis had in terms of they had a joint command, which the Arabs did not have. They were very bad at communicating with each other. I mean, again, this is supposed to be a podcast about Arab ideology, so I'm just going to briefly cover this kind of stuff. We'll talk about warfare later on. Also, Israel did have the benefit in terms of equipment. They did have way better equipment than the Arabs had. The Arabs had like old Soviet equipment. As everybody knows, Israel was getting a lot of funding from the great powers. They were actually getting funding from the Soviet Union as well for for a brief period of time.
Oh, the Soviets, so centrist.
Yeah, Stalin supported the creation of Israel, so it's actually funny how
bamboozled again.
But anyways, other than that, we did see the loss of the Arabs multiple times afterwards. Again, the main reasons to point out is funding, equipment, and then lack of coordination. And I mean, what else, Tarek? Well, there's only so many excuses you can make.
Oh, I can't say that the performance of the Arabs in the battlefield is something that's deeply intertwined with the politics of Pan-Arabism. Because, well, guys, we're not going to be one great Pan-Arab nation while our enemies are still around, and we can't really defeat them, or, well, in a way, can't really, join our efforts properly to at least pose a challenge to the world. So I'd say that the Pan-Arabism started dying after we just started getting beaten the F out all the time. Also, I'd like to point the 15 wars against Iran from the Iraqi part, and also it's not the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, it's the Iraqi reconquest of Kuwait. The liberation of Kuwait. But because one thing is fighting against Iran, this third element. Well, they might be Muslims, quote unquote. But still, they are Persians. They're not like us. So we can say they are a third element. And we went to war against them. And in the end, it was a costly war that didn't really get into anything. And then you had us fighting against fellow Arabs in Kuwait. We had some. We had plenty of other massacres around the Arab world because we had so many massacres anyway. We had the civil war in Lebanon. We had the Saudis and the Egyptians back in some autistic island they have in the Red Sea. So and the Yemenis, because we had a Egyptian Yemeni war. Sorry, Omar.
Yeah, to add to that a little bit in regards to the liberation of Kuwait. Although you saw a lot of Arab governments rallying against Iraq, the actual position from the people, the Arab population, was pretty positive because, as we've touched upon a little bit earlier in other podcasts, Arabs don't like Khalijis, and Kuwaitis are like apex Khalijis, apex predator Khalijis. Like they're the fattest, most McDonald-ridden corpses of of their Arab ancestors. But
This is horrible.
but yeah, so I mean, the people were really, as opposed to the Iran-Iraq War, where a lot of the population saw it as like this fruitless endeavor, and it was just adding bodies to
The kill count, it's basically just a 1 million people die.
as opposed to the liberation of Kuwait.
Yeah, well, it happened like it was
Yeah.
instant. If I was thinking
It was instant, so it was fast. It was, I mean, for all intents and purposes, bloodless. And again, this was backed up by the American ambassador. Saddam met with her beforehand and said, "I want to invade Kuwait." They said, "Well, we don't care." Obviously, they ended up caring because it was Gulf War #1. This is how it started. But again, to preface, the people were actually pretty happy about that, and they did see it as the next step in pan-Arabism, because Saddam was threatening Saudi Arabia and saying that he was he was going to put Arab nationalism over Mecca. So just a little tangent over there, but yeah, continue talking.
Oh, that was beautiful. But I'd say that's a point when it starts to fragment, because we see Arabs just flying at each other, basically. And that's not a good way of having unity. Something we kind of tend to ignore is what they had between Egypt and Yemen, which was also why do we ignore Yemen so much? We should have like an episode just for Yemen, because there's so much stuff happening there and also happened there, and we just blur over it because, well, who cares about Yemenis, right?
Because they speak a weird accent, that's why.
And they're just like high on cut all the time. So, but that would be something that, again. But we digress. But indeed, the failures in our great conquests tended to shape Arab nationalism, and by the end of the 20th century, 20th, by the end of the 20th century, I would say that the Arab nationalism had a very low morale. Perhaps the two last bastions were was Saddam back in Iraq. I can't even say about Bashar, because Bashar was really reforming the country, at least when he took office. And we still had Gaddafi, but Gaddafi changed a lot of his rhetoric from what he had implemented in the 60s. He was getting much more in bed with what you call Pan-Africanism. That's another cool story, actually.
Yeah, just to add to that, we saw that Gaddafi, when he initially took power in Libya, he changed the flag to the pan-Arab colors, which it's red, white, and black. After he got upset with the Arab nations for their lack of Arab unity, he just changed it to all green, the Islamic color. So that's when you see the divergence in his opinion of the Arab unity project. But I digress. That's just something I wanted to add.
I think it's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that all. No, but it's true, for real. Then again, Arabs are so complicated. And let's.
I think that we should stress that the last two bastions that you touched upon, Saddam and Assad, they were doing a good job maintaining security in the infrastructure of the society. We live in a society where you need safety to thrive, and they provided a fair amount of safety. I think we can both agree. Obviously, not so much nowadays with Assad, but this comes down to external forces playing a factor in shaping the country. We saw right now the modern Western states are trying to overthrow Assad. And they're intervening and funding their various proxy units that they're using to destabilize the country. And if those external forces weren't a factor, we can both agree that Syria would be a million times more stable and secure under Assad, as opposed to right now in Iraq with these nationalist forces gone. Right now we're having protests in Basra about people hating the Iranian influence, and they're burning down police stations, and they shut down the internet and canceled Facebook for the population. So
why is Iraq like that?
Because the Middle East be like it do, Tariq. It be like it do.
It do.
It really be like that.
The Middle East is an angry place. I think this is gonna cause a little more anger.
But yeah, so that's something we should touch upon. Actually, is briefly in Iraq right now we're seeing a resurgence in this type of Arab rule, where they're very sick of Iranians playing a factor in the politics. We've had the Dawa party in Iraq for quite a while, which again is like this Iranian-funded political party. It's been there since 2003, and then we just had this Shiite Ayatollah wannabe just get elected, and people are really sick of it. They've been protesting a lot, and we're seeing police forces police and military being deployed to quell these rebellions. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we see Ba'ath Part 2, Ba'ath Part 2 Iranian Boogaloo. Anyway.
Yes, Omar and Tariq just announced Ba'ath 2.
But yeah, I mean, it's actually really sad because we see, even within people that I know in Iraq that were their family were adamantly against Saddam. They hated him. They had problems with him. Even they're missing the Ba'ath because of the stability that it provided over there. People right now, I mean, they're getting paid shit. Their infrastructure is shit. The government doesn't care about them, and there's a huge brain drain. At least under the Ba'ath, I mean, these nationalist leaders, they provided a solid infrastructure for education, healthcare. I mean, the people were being taken care of. They had their basic needs being taken care of. Although there was obviously a huge breach in what we call public forum. People couldn't criticize the government. People were tortured routinely for going against the word of the government. But I mean, that's the price that people pay. In some cases, people want security and safety more than they care about democracy and free speech. Democracy is a pretty new concept to the Arab world.
I think we've got to wrap it up now, but I agree completely with you. And I would say that people are quite missing those times because they realize that, we don't know how to be democratic. But in a way, that's the point. It has been this dilemma that's been has been brought up quite a lot lately, which is, Saddam was a tyrant. Saddam was a bloody dictator. And Gaddafi was the same. Gaddafi was high on coke all the time and governing while having these horrible prisons and all that. But in a way, they knew how to manage their country, and they ruled through fear. But it appears that's the only way you can rule those regions. And today, that's what has been in the debate. Well, we have ISIS. Back when ISIS was still a thing, but it had these enormous terrorist pockets that just came from that power vacuum, and you had 10 times or maybe 100 times more atrocious things going on, added to the complete lack of public service providers, the complete lack of security, and a future even. So people and that's perhaps one of the reasons why Assad was allowed to stay in Syria, was that, these guys are horrible, but if they're not there, it's going to be 100 times more horrible.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how Saddam paved the way for Bashar Assad to stay in power. I mean, there are still forces trying to remove him, but I think there would have been a much swifter response for removing him if the chaos that ensued Saddam's death didn't happen.
If I were to say, I'd say it would have been much more successful if Bashar suffered a coup from inside the military than a democratic popular uprising.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially how his family came to power. So, I mean,
yeah, that's how stuff happens in the Arab world. You can't really public support is important. Public backing is very important, of course, but without really a military and a large wing defecting the government, defecting from the loyalist forces and just trying to overthrow for military means, it's hard. And Syria didn't have that. You didn't have a mass, desertion?
Yeah, desertion.
From the military, which was the case in Iraq. It was just crazy there. So I'd say that's something that made Assad resilient.
And we don't want to indulge on too long, so we're going to try to keep this a little bit shorter and just cover the main topics. But to wrap this up, Tariq, how would you tie this in a nice little bow for everybody?
I think we're seeing a problem now because everyone's talking about the repercussions of the Arab Spring, the Arab world. It's going to be a super democratic place now, which is not going to be the case. We're just going to get way more authoritarian. It's going to make Saddam Hussein look like Nelson Mandela or something like that. No, the truth is, it's hard to say. Some say that Arab nationalism is dead. I wouldn't say so. I would say that Pan-Arabism really took a blow, and I can't see it recovering for the next decades. We see so many Arab countries just trying to rekindle relations with the West, rekindle relations even with Israel. And who's left? Who's the last openly Arab nationalist? Even Bashar changed a lot his discourse from Pan-Arabism or from Arab unity to a much more sectarian, at least not explicitly, but in his policy making. Syria has become much less secular, much less Pan-Arabist in a way. So it's hard times ahead, and we're just gonna see whoever takes this century. Of course, going to have a lot of coups because there's always coups in the Middle East, but we can't really expect any democracy to come to the Middle East so early.
Yeah, it's a bit sad. I think a lot of people look at Bashar Assad as the last bastion of Arab nationalism, but he has been tainted quite a bit by the Iranian influence. And I don't know, like you said, it's been such a strong blow against Arab nationalism in the in the past years that I don't know if it can recover to the way it was, but what we're seeing like in Iraq right now with the protest, it gives hope that there might be some kind of counter-revolution against the powers that be, but I don't know if I'm very optimistic about that because, again, the external forces now are so strong and we don't have a counterbalance like the USSR to dissuade Western powers from messing in the Middle East that we can only assume that America would stop whatever's happening early on and prevent some kind of nationalist leader.
Please save us.
But yeah, so to conclude this, I want to say the only real solution is to allow Varg Vikernes to rule the Arab world with his Nordic principles.
He lived in Iraq, by the way.
Yeah, so
like 2 or 3 years. Or
Varg
something.
is essentially an Iraqi Nordic king because he lived in Iraq. He is the true heir to the Arab world. I think that we should all bow down to Sheikh Varg, Caliph, the Nordic Caliphate.
Insha Odin.
Yeah. Hail Odin. Anyways, guys.
Hail Odin. Hail Allah.
Thank you guys so much for listening. Be sure to...
we gotta link the petition.
Yeah, we have a petition on change.org to make sure that Lauren Southern and Ben Shapiro join us. This is a petition to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Hello, Bibi. Shalom.
I think we have a pretty good chance of Bibi sending his advisor Ben Shapiro to our podcast to help us get some views.
If we reach 10,000 signatures, his sister is also gonna make a video podcast with us.
Yeah.
I think we're not allowed to say that, by the way. I think if someone found out about that shit, we could get sued and shit. So.
Yeah, I don't want to get sued by by Mossad and Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, we are in the watch list anyway, so
yeah.
And whoever's listening to this podcast is already in a watch list, so it's fine.
Exactly. Again, guys, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like our change.org petition, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.
I saw, I came, I saw, I praised the Lord, then break the law. I take what's mine, and take some more. It rains, it pours, it rains, it pours. I came,